Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review the first 5 episodes of Season three's The Last Man on Earth. So, man, do I really just enjoy this show for how ultimately it goes into taking a well-known actor and quickly killing them off. Or a well-known actor to me. I don't know about everyone else, but when looking at it, I was like, oh no, like, here's another person that I otherwise could be, like, knowing of this person, because I've seen movies like Tag and Baby Driver and stuff along those lines. And I was like, no! But if anything, we also get a character that I had also seen in the Captain America First Avengers movie. And so recently I was kind of very appreciative about that, to have this character also in this seemingly third season as well. And I'll get to that in actual spoilers. So, going into these first 5 episodes, we really have it to where it's kind of pandemonium for this group. We end up having to where there's some times where I think that this season gets very interesting because I think it tries to go wildly different than what it was trying to do before, and that is quite obvious with any third season that they have to go that route. But it just kind of seemed like this season was kind of really trying to give us just not like, oh, okay, these guys are just messing around and effing around and whatever. This time around, it's much more just like they're really trying to fight for every resource, which in this season, for the first 5 episodes, the real true resource or the real true thing that they really need to tie themselves on is their own survival. But then eventually they have to go into common resource management later on, like electricity and water and stuff along those lines, to ultimately go and bizarrely take showers within the place that they end up towards the end of these first 5 episodes. Going into here, we really kind of like. I like the fact that we kind of leave off we go into with this season exactly how the third season had left off. There's not like all of a sudden like absence of time. There's not a big like, hey, 5 years later, or like a day later, and then you have to like backtrack for like 24. Like, I like the fact that it's a very smooth transition from the end of season 2 to the beginning of season 3. It seems very flawless. If anything, I honestly kind of feel very heartbroken for the girl that plays Gale in these 5 episodes. It just kind of feels like she is mostly just kind of a person that, as we go along here, is just having issues tolerating the group. She kind of is almost alienating herself away from the group, and I could really just go like, wow, like I feel so bad for Gale. I feel so bad for Gale, but I also kind of feel bad for Erica as well, because recently it's just like we really don't see what exactly Todd is all like hot potatoing, if that's even a word, told me have as an action. But we have it to where Todd is kind of like in several different places at one time, and so we end up having it to where Todd is otherwise like we're not actually seeing Todd's kind of everywhere all at one time kind of thing, which we saw earlier in the second season. Like, now we're just kind of ultimately going like, okay, yeah, Todd is still doing all of this stuff supposedly, but now we have to have it to where like, okay, so what is it that the whole ensemble as a whole is doing much more so than individuals? which that's what ultimately I like about these first 5 episodes. Saying it, of course, in a very cryptic-like manner, but when looking at it, I really just still have been enjoying these first 5 episodes. I kind of, if there is kind of a if there is kind of one thing that I could ultimately just have a problem with, it would probably just be the fact that it seems that uh, they are like the whole road trip thing. I didn't really care for, but I guess it's a thing to just kind of kill time or have a filler of time in the show. That's the only thing that I didn't care about, but everything else going on in these first 5 seasons I thought was really intriguing. So let's ultimately go into spoiler time because 5 minutes are up. I don't know why I time it out that well. It's not my purpose to do that. It just happens that way every single time to get my 5 minutes in. But anyways, let's go into the double five time count. Ultimately, after that amount of time, we're going to go into spoilers. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So, immediately we have to remember in the season finale of season 2, we end up having it to where Pat, who is the man on the boat that is to arrive on onto Tucson, which is ultimately Phil's home, which is ultimately you get the situation. Tandy, if for some people. So I'm still calling him Phil because there's no Phil 2 anymore. So I'm just going to call him Phil for the rest of this time period, and hopefully that works. So we end up having it to where people are scrambling. They're very undecided about what all is going on. We end up having it to where Phil is like holding binoculars and ultimately just checking out what's going on with these people. We end up finding 3 men that is to otherwise come off of this boat. Pat, of course, that we know from season 2, and 2 men that we're unfamiliar with. One is Jon Hamm, which ultimately I know from Tag and even Black Mirror, and ultimately, what was the other thing that I mentioned? Baby Driver, there we go. We ultimately have him come in here, and his character is very interesting, and I'll explain why in a second. We ultimately have another character that is named Lewis that I believe was on Captain America First Avengers. I'm not 100% sure about that because I didn't IMDb him. But anyways, so we have these guys come in, and ultimately we have them seemingly hold these people at gunpoint with their hazmat-ish like suits, and ultimately we end up that there is eventually at some point we end up having to where it seems that Pat didn't actually want to kill any of these people, but it seems that there is kind of a imbalance of power with Phil and his group and Pat and his. So we end up having to where eventually that one person is to get a weapon away from one of the hazmat men and ends up shooting him, and that ends up sadly being Jon Hamm's character. I believe Melissa and Jon Hamm, I think, were both in Mad Men together. If I am incorrect about that, I apologize. But I do remember Jon Hamm was in Mad Men. So we end up seeing Jon Hamm dying. And so after that death, both Pat and Lewis both realize that they're like, hey, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, we weren't really going to kill anybody. And hey, how about we just call a truce? So they really just have a truce by burying Jon Hamm's character, and ultimately we have a funeral, and we immediately see the previous people that had died in seasons before, and then we have just a picture of what Jon Hamm looks like when he died. And I thought that was really interesting, I guess, drawn by Carol, of course. So we end up going on here, and so we eventually have it to where it seems that Lewis is slowly but surely like being more open to the group, and ultimately at some point we have Lewis who even takes off his hazmat gear at some point. But we end up having it to where Pat will always keep his gear on because ultimately he's a conspiracy theorist and he thinks that the government will want him to take off his hazmat suit, but he won't. Very kooky individual. So this leads to eventually the group not getting any trust from Pat. Like they really are thinking that this guy is unhinged. There's several evidence to lead that up to him being very untrusting. It seems that at some point we have it to where Pat is reasonably going off the rails, let's just say. So we end up having to where we end up having them eventually running off to get away from Pat. They end up driving away from Pat, trying to find any way to get away from Pat, because we have it to where really we end up having to where this group of Phil's group is getting very paranoid about Pat and Lewis. But again, Lewis kind of earns his stripes for this group, but there's still paranoia there. So we end up having to where eventually Todd ends up running over Pat in the middle of the night. And so we end up having it to where Todd is ultimately mortified because he's like, oh my god, like I've killed a man. We end up having it to where ultimately Carol had mentioned how many numerous times that she had run over something, and at some point one of the animals that she had run over had said help at some point or something along those lines. She had probably admitted that it was maybe a parrot. So we end up having it to ultimately Phil is trying to comfort Todd and ultimately convince Todd that Pat had not died. Ultimately making up some story that Pat was still alive, that ultimately he was going to come after the group, and so Todd did not kill him, is what Phil was trying to lie to Todd about, to give him comfort, which was really nice. So we end up having to where ultimately everybody is super paranoid that Phil is coming after them, and ultimately we have walls all over the house that ultimately give a convincing statement that he'll come back for them or whatever. And so we end up having it to where Phil is to put people at ease, put on a play that ultimately is to convince the rest of the group that Pat is dead somehow, by basically going and attacking some dummy in a hazmat suit to ultimately convince people that Pat is dead. But reasonably, no one buys that, and we end up having it to where now Phil is having to either convince the group or convince Todd that Pat is either dead or not dead. And so there's this back and forth motion where Phil is going with the group and saying like, hey guys, Phil is dead. And then he's going to Todd and he's like, he's not dead. And he's going back and forth, just ultimately trying to otherwise just delay on the fact of just I'm telling neither one of these people the real truth. Because eventually we know full well that Phil had noticed that Pat was dead. He went with 4 to 5 different dummies strapped to his body to otherwise poke a stick at Pat to notice he was dead. And so we ultimately have it to where ultimately Phil ends up grabbing Pat and tossing him in the garbage, because ultimately, rightfully so, he had tried to kill his brother Mike. And so we end up having to ultimately to convince everybody that Pat is now dead. Phil goes back to the garbage, but we end up finding out that Pat's body is completely gone. And so everybody is in a severe panic. We end up having to where Melissa is just. You can consistently see the longer that we go within these 5 episodes, how really unsane she is starting to slowly but surely become. But then also, you can kind of say, well, maybe there is some justification for some of this of which that Melissa had said, and I guess I could really appreciate that. Where like when looking at it, there's maybe two sides of the coin of Melissa. Maybe she's crazy, maybe she's not. I don't know, but let's go on. So we end up having to where they go out of their way to try to make people seem safe. We end up having to where Phil, throughout his house, nails down a bunch of those singing frogs that ultimately are on a log, like a ton of them all over this wall, to ultimately have it to where if someone is to come through the home, they'd ultimately be having to sing Jeremiah was a bullfrog, and the fish that ultimately like comes off the thing and starts singing the thing that was a long time ago, a really novelty item gift to give to people. So we end up having it to where Carol ends up walking through, and Phil ends up saying something nice to her, and but there's a infinite amount of in a hallway these frogs that are like Jeremiah was and it's going off crazy and it's all wild. So we end up having to where Todd is like, do we really have to like have all these frogs or have all these fish all like simultaneously singing this song while anyone comes through the door? And we end up having to where they switch and they try to figure out some other kind of a way of kind of making people safe. Carol comes in ultimately to have her like say like, hey, we should probably give everyone whistles, and ultimately have them wear tap dancing shoes to ultimately whenever they are to be thwarted by somebody, then they can just woo and blow the whistle and tap their tap dancing shoes. And Gail's like, you're not gonna catch me dead wearing those. So it gets so much more awful. So we end up having to where Melissa is ultimately having like a machine gun in hand, and ultimately she's like playing landmines out by the beach to where ultimately Phil and Lewis are playing football, and a landmine goes off. And so like they're just like, Lewis just gets to the point of escalation of just like, why can't we just move somewhere else? Why are we still here? If someone is to think that we are going to live here, then why don't we move elsewhere? And everyone is just like, wow, I guess, why didn't we think of that before? So we end up pushing on to have seemingly the group are horribly trying to figure out where the heck to live. Everybody has their place that they like. Oh, well, I want to live here. Well, I want to live there. I want to live here. I want to live here. And so you have this complication of people that are all just jumbling around, just like, where are we going to live? And so ultimately, all end up deciding to otherwise go and seemingly live in this building that seems to be some kind of business building. And eventually we have it to where, because we end up having it to where there's seemingly several floors to this building, and ultimately there's like cubicles and stuff along those lines in this building. And we really end up having it to where once they get there through the road journey that they had gone into, that led them there, because ultimately I don't want to really go through that whole road journey thing, because that was just a means to an end kind of thing. And we really have it to where recently that entire road trip was just to have Phil really annoy Lewis by ultimately singing his own songs while he's road tripping because because Lewis wants nothing to do with Phil. Lewis is ultimately driving with Phil, and Phil is ultimately driving Lewis crazy. So we end up having to where Lewis is just like, I'm just gonna put up with him. I'm just gonna put up with him. So we end up having it to where I think Gail ends up going somewhere where Phil is not, because ultimately, if she would have had to drive with Phil to go anywhere, she would have ultimately said like, life is too short, and she would have just ended her life, I guess is what she used to threaten. We also realized that evidently Todd had mentioned that seemingly Gail is repackaging up the Gordon dummy, and so we end up having to where there's a whole thing of that where Gail ultimately says, "Yeah, like you're never there for me. You're never there for me, Todd. I thought we were supposed to have this free love thing, and now I have to have free love by myself." So we end up having to where Todd is saying like, well, okay, I guess this relationship is just over between us, kind of thing. And so we end up having to where Todd ends up latching himself onto Melissa, and ultimately holding hands with Melissa, even though Melissa is not quite all that there, if some people would decide that. So we end up having it to where, okay, now we are on to the building. They're going in, and they're really appreciating the rarities that their other establishment did not have. Ultimately, to have light and electricity and whatever, and to seemingly be able to have like some kind of resources that they didn't in previous place. And it'll be interesting to see like how they adjust this establishment more once they get further along in here. So we end up having to where reasonably there seems to be some power outages that ultimately Phil is realizing. It's like, hey, what's going on here? And so ultimately we end up having it to where Phil goes and checks and ultimately fixes the power outage. But now he's starting to get paranoid that maybe someone in the group is sabotaging this building. And so ultimately he goes right away to the very first person that is the new guy, Lewis. Ultimately we have it to where Phil is ultimately mentioning to Lewis is like, oh well, hey, like you must know where the wire cutters are, don't you, Lewis? We end up having to where this whole time we have Phil, every single time the power goes out, he immediately runs to Lewis and is like, like, what did you do? Like, why did you cut the power? Why are you cutting the power? And so we end up having Lewis just going like, dude, I didn't cut the power. Because we end up having to where both Todd and Phil are sharing a side-by-side shower cubicle. And while they could not finish their shower, they end up having it to where Phil is otherwise like, I'm like, dude, I'm taking a shower and somebody's cutting the power. What's going on? So Phil confronts Lewis with his taped on eyebrows that he has through a bulk of these 5 episodes, because we have it to where Carol can't understand Phil's facial things that he does without eyebrows. So we end up having it to where ultimately Phil is to accuse Lewis, but it ends up kind of blowing up in Phil's face, because we end up finding out the entire time that Carol had cut the power. And so now there is quite possibly some turmoil still probably between Phil and Lewis, but also with why Carol cut out the power. Because we ultimately have it to where the first time that Carol had cut the power, she had ultimately mentioned it's like, well, if this power doesn't come back on, then maybe we should move. Maybe this was a lemon building, and maybe we should just go and try to find some other seemingly other place to live. And so I'm wondering if really Carol really just wanted to just stay in Tucson no matter what. If it led to their death, then it led to their death. Like, I think that Carol had really just had so many memories with Tucson that ultimately when she is having to go to a brand new place, maybe she's just a person that doesn't like change. So, really, that is to just be discovered down the line, later episodes. And I'm really still enjoying the season so far. I kind of, as per usual, kind of rushed through this. But when looking at it, I also had a lot of fun through these episodes. When looking at it, like to see the Back to the Future DeLorean yet again in these episodes, I really got a good yeah, I like that. Reasonably, when we had every single car had some kind of previous value that was ultimately a thing that was a relic 30 years ago or whatever. We end up having to a reasonably like that's kind of like, hey, this show still has so much money to blow that yeah, they can rent out a DeLorean from Back to the Future. Hey, they can rent any number of vehicles that are seemingly from a film or show or whatever to ultimately just be like, yeah, like we really want to spend money because I guess this show is really just a tax write-off for whoever. And so at the end of the day, that's, I think, all I wanted to say so far about these first 5 episodes. The fact that John Hamm ultimately died without saying a word, I was like, no! Because I'm like, I've seen him in, like, Black Mirror, where he had, like, an entire episode where he's, like, telling a story to a man. And ultimately, I think that one is quite possibly White Christmas, but I could be wrong about that. But anyways, yeah, so I'm going to call this one a wrap. Where do I think Pat is? I reasonably think that that guy is still alive. Like, I don't think that he died or I don't think his body decomposed. I think he's still alive, but I just think that ultimately he is probably never going to come back. Because we end up having to where Lewis was like, you know what, I've been with this man for a fairly long time, and I don't think he's a person that's going to come back with a grudge. Like, I think he's just going to go about his business and go on. And kind of Phil kind of is like, yeah, I think he was kind of like that too. Because we end up having to where Phil makes friends of his enemies. When Phil and Phil were there, we ended up having to where Tandy was making and going out of his way to be friends with Phil. When Pat arrives, Phil was doing the exact same thing to Pat. And so, reasoning I could really just say that so every single time Phil is going to have a nemesis or an enemy or whatever, he's eventually just going to find a way through his own stubbornness to ultimately go and make a friend out of his enemy. Because that's just who he is. Like, I think ultimately, like, Phil was that way with Todd, he was that way with Phil, and ultimately he's that way seemingly with Pat. I even think Mike was the same way because ultimately at the end of it all, Mike was Phil's brother. So, I'm going to call that a review, an episode. I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.